I drove 8 hours to reach my son's apartment, and I almost didn't go. That's the part that still keeps me up at night. How close I came to just staying home. It started with a feeling. I know how that sounds. A feeling. My daughter-in-law would probably laugh at that if she heard me say it. She laughed at a lot of things I said, but I've been a mother for 34 years, and I've learned to trust that particular kind of unease that settles in your chest like weather coming, the kind that doesn't go away no matter how many times you tell yourself everything is fine. My son. I'll call him my boy because that's what he still was to me, even at 32, had been sick for about 8 months. Lymphoma. The treatable kind, his doctors said at first, which I clung to like a life raft. He'd been doing chemo in cycles, and every few weeks I'd call and he'd say he was tired, but okay, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him, and because his wife, Roxanne, would get on the phone and say the same thing. He's doing well, he's resting, don't worry. I lived in Tennessee. They were in Phoenix. I'd offered to come out a dozen times. Every single time, Roxanne found a reason it wasn't a good time. He needs to rest and company tires him out. The apartment is small. He has appointments this week. I was being managed. I see that clearly now, but at the time I just accepted it because she was his wife, and I didn't want to cause problems in his marriage on top of everything else. The last time I spoke to him, 2 days before I got in my car, his voice was different. Not what he said, just the way he sounded. Quieter than tired, like something had gone out of him. I asked him if he was eating. He said sure. I asked if Roxanne was there with him. He paused just a half second too long and said she'd run some errands. I barely slept that night. The next morning I called his cell and got voicemail. I called the apartment landline. They still had one because the building was older, and no one answered. I called Roxanne's cell and it rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I left a message. I texted, nothing back for 6 hours. I called the hospital where he'd been receiving treatment. I know they can't tell you much over the phone without being family, but I am family. I told them I was his mother and I was trying to reach him and I was worried. The woman on the phone said she couldn't confirm or deny whether a patient was admitted, but she said it in a way, the pause before she said it, the careful neutral of her voice, that told me everything. I packed a bag in 40 minutes. I left my neighbor a key for the cat. I called my sister from the car. You don't even know if he's there, she said. I know, I said, and I kept driving. I hit the Phoenix city limits at just past 9 in the evening. I went straight to the hospital. I didn't go to their apartment first, didn't call ahead again. I just went. He was in the ICU. He'd been there for 3 days. 3 days. And no one had called me. The nurse who came to speak with me was kind. She could see from my face that I was not prepared, and she sat with me for a few minutes in the little family room off the main corridor and explained that he had developed a serious infection, that his immune system was severely compromised from the treatment, that the last 72 hours had been critical. She said his condition had stabilized somewhat in the past day. She said he was conscious and that yes, I could go in. I asked her who had been listed as his emergency contact. She looked at the chart. His wife, she said. I asked when Roxanne had last been in to see him. She checked the visitor log. Then she looked at me with an expression I will never forget. Not pity exactly, more like she was bracing herself on my behalf. 2 days ago, she said, he'd been in the ICU for 3 days. She had visited once, on day 1. I sat with him for 2 hours that first night. He cried when he saw me. Not loudly. He didn't have the strength for that. Just tears running sideways into the pillow. He kept saying he was sorry, which broke my heart in a way I don't have words for, because he had nothing to be sorry for. Nothing. I held his hand, and I didn't say much. I just let him know I was there, that I wasn't going anywhere. At some point, he fell asleep, and I stepped out into the hallway, and I called Roxanne. She answered on the second ring, which surprised me. There was noise in the background, music, voices, the kind of ambient sound that belongs to a party or a restaurant, somewhere people were having a good time. Oh, she said when she heard my voice. "You're in Phoenix?" Just like that. Oh. Like I'd popped in unexpectedly on a Tuesday. I told her I was at the hospital. I told her I was with our son. I asked her where she was. She said she was at a friend's get-together. She said she needed to decompress because the stress had been a lot. I stood in that hospital hallway, outside the room where my son was lying in an ICU bed, and I listened to her tell me she needed to decompress. I didn't yell. I thought about it. I chose not to. I said very calmly that she might want to come to the hospital. She said she'd come by tomorrow. I hung up. I went back to my son's apartment that night to sleep because the nurses encouraged it. He was stable and resting, and I would be no use to anyone exhausted. Roxanne had given me a spare key years ago, one of those obligatory gestures that probably felt like nothing to her at the time. I let myself in and turned on the kitchen light. The apartment was a mess in a particular way, not the mess of someone who'd been too sick and too busy caring for a sick person to clean. The mess of someone who'd been living their life while someone else dealt with the hard part. There were wine glasses on the counter, 2 of them. A pile of shopping bags from stores I recognized as expensive. A receipt on the table. I wasn't snooping, it was just sitting there. From a restaurant I knew charged about $90 a plate. I didn't touch anything. I just looked. I went to the guest room, which still had a bed in it, for when I'd stayed over once, 3 years ago. I lay down on top of the covers in my clothes, and I stared at the ceiling. I thought about Roxanne's voice on the phone. The noise in the background. I thought about the visitor log. I thought about my son crying when he saw me because I think he'd stopped believing anyone was coming. I didn't sleep much. Over the next few days, I was at the hospital every morning by 7 and stayed until they made me leave. Roxanne came by once on the 3rd day. She stayed for maybe 40 minutes. She spent a portion of that time on her phone. When she left, my son watched the door close behind her and didn't say anything for a long time. I didn't push him to talk about it. He was too sick for that conversation, and I knew it. But one afternoon, when he was feeling a little stronger, he asked me if I could look into something for him. He said there were accounts, a joint checking, a savings they'd built up together, and he'd been trying to access them from his phone to check the balances, but the login kept failing. He thought maybe there was a technical glitch. I took his phone. I tried. The credentials didn't work. He asked me to try his email to reset the password. When I went into his email, I saw things I wasn't looking for and didn't want to see. Not messages from Roxanne exactly, but confirmations. Reservation confirmations for places he clearly wasn't at. Booking confirmations for things that weren't medical expenses. I kept my voice steady. I told him the account might just need to be reset in person and not to worry about it. That night, I looked into it properly. The savings account, which had been in both their names and had held what I knew was a significant amount, money my son had saved carefully over years of working a job he was good at and took seriously, had been drawn down to almost nothing. Over about 2 months. Mostly cash withdrawals and wire transfers. He'd been in treatment. He hadn't been watching it. He'd trusted her. I sat at the kitchen table with his laptop, and I felt something I can only describe as a door closing inside me. Not anger, not yet. Something colder and quieter. The kind of clarity that comes when you stop hoping you're wrong. My son had given me a limited power of attorney over his finances when he started treatment. Practical, something his attorney had recommended, so that if he was incapacitated, there would be someone who could act on his behalf. Roxanne had not liked it at the time. She'd made a comment about how it was unnecessary and how she was his wife. He'd done it anyway. I want to be careful here about what I did and didn't do, because some of it matters. I consulted with an attorney in Phoenix. I found one who could see me quickly, explain the situation, and ask what my options were. I want to be clear, I acted on legal advice. I didn't act out of anger, even though I had plenty of cause for it. There were accounts in his name alone that Roxanne had been accessing under credentials I believe she'd obtained without his active consent during his illness. The attorney explained the distinctions carefully. There were things I could do and things I couldn't. I focused on what I could. I had access frozen on the accounts that fell within the POA scope, while my son was still living and while the document was still valid. I contacted the relevant institutions. I documented what I found. I made sure there was a record. Roxanne came home 2 days later from wherever she'd been. I know because she called me, not my son, me, and she was not calm. She asked me what I'd done. Her voice had a particular quality, like someone who is used to being the one who makes people nervous and has just realized the dynamic has shifted. I told her I'd acted within the scope of the legal authority my son had given me, and that if she had questions, she should contact an attorney. She used some words I won't repeat. She told me I had no right. She told me that what was his was hers. She told me she would make sure I regretted this. I told her she should go see her husband, that he was in the ICU and he was asking for her. She came to the hospital the next day. I was there. We did not speak to each other in that room. We sat on opposite sides of his bed, and my son looked at the ceiling. He held on for another 3 weeks. I was there every day. I slept in the family lounge more nights than not. I learned the names of his nurses. I brought in things from outside. Food he asked for when he had appetite, books he wanted but couldn't finish, a small plant for the windowsill because he said the room felt institutional and he wanted something living in it. We talked. Really talked. The way you do when time starts to feel finite and the things you'd been putting off saying start to feel urgent. He told me things about his marriage I hadn't known. Not in a bitter way. He wasn't bitter, which was one of the things about him that always undid me. He said he thought he'd chosen someone he thought would be strong, and instead, she'd just been defended. He said he was sorry for shutting me out for so long. I told him he had nothing to apologize for. He told me about a kid in his unit. He'd been in the military for 6 years before his diagnosis, something he was proud of. A young soldier who'd gone through treatment for a different cancer. Alone, no family nearby, had struggled to even get to appointments because of transportation and logistics. My son had tried to help him where he could. He said it bothered him how many people in that situation fell through the cracks. He made me promise something. He made me promise that if anything happened to him, I'd find a way to do something about that. Not revenge, not drama, something that would actually help someone. I promised him. He died on a Tuesday morning, just after 6. The light was coming in through that little east-facing window, and it fell across the bed in a way that I will always remember. I was holding his hand. He was not in pain. The months that followed were the hardest of my life. I won't pretend otherwise. There was an estate to deal with. There was a will. He had one, properly drawn up, something Roxanne hadn't known the full details of. He had made arrangements. His attorney, not mine, his, walked me through what he'd put in place, and I will say only that he had been thoughtful and careful, the way he was about most things. Roxanne contested aspects of it. That went through the proper legal process. I'm not going to detail all of it because some of it is still private and some of it is still painful. I will say that a process played out, and at the end of that process, I was able to honor what he'd asked me to do. I will say one more thing about Roxanne. There was a hearing related to the estate matter, not criminal, a civil proceeding. At one point, she looked across the room at me and said, loud enough for the room to hear, that she would see me destroyed. The judge asked her to clarify that statement. She couldn't. The judge was not amused. There were consequences to that outburst, as there tend to be when you say things like that in front of a judge who was already forming opinions about your character. 6 months after my son died, I set up a fund. I named it after him. I'll call it the Emmett Fund here because that was his name, and his name deserves to be said. The Emmett Fund provides practical support to military veterans and active service members who are undergoing cancer treatment without local family support. Transportation to appointments, help with logistics, meals, Small things that turn out not to be small at all when you're sick and scared, and the person who was supposed to be in your corner has decided that their own comfort matters more. I run it out of my home with 2 volunteers and a small board. We don't have a lot of resources. We have enough. And in the first year, we helped 11 people in a way I believe my son would recognize and be glad of. I did not get justice in any dramatic sense. I didn't get back what was taken. I don't walk around feeling victorious. Some days I walk around feeling like I lost the most important person in my life, and nothing that came after changes that. But I made him a promise, and I kept it. That's what I have. And some days, especially the days when the light comes through a window at a certain angle and catches me off guard, it turns out to be enough. People ask me sometimes if I feel like justice was served. I never quite know how to answer that. What I know is this: Roxanne made a series of choices. She chose comfort over presence. She chose spending over standing by. She chose a party over a hospital room. And every one of those choices had a weight to it that she didn't reckon with until it was too late to pretend otherwise. I didn't cause her consequences. She built them herself, one decision at a time, and eventually they caught up with her in a courtroom in front of a judge who had seen enough people like her to know exactly what he was looking at. That's not luck. That's not fate in any mystical sense. That's just the plain and ordinary truth that how you treat people, especially people who are vulnerable, people who are counting on you, tends to come back around. Not always on your timeline, not always in the way you'd script it. But it comes. Emmett knew this. He was never a bitter person, and I think that was partly because he understood, in some quiet way, that bitterness is just borrowed suffering. He'd seen enough in his years of service to know that people who act without integrity don't usually get away with it forever. He used to say that character is what you do when no one's watching. He said it lightly, like it was obvious, and I suppose for him it was. What I learned from all of this, and I mean really learned, the kind that lives in your body and not just your head, is that love requires you to show up. Not when it's convenient, not when the circumstances are comfortable, when it's hard, when you're scared, when there is nothing in it for you except the knowledge that someone you love needs you to be there. That's the whole thing. That's all of it. I also learned something about myself that I didn't expect. I spent a lot of years being careful not to overstep, careful not to cause friction in my son's marriage, careful to stay in my lane. And while he was lying in that ICU, I understood that my caution had cost us time. Not enormously. I don't blame myself for his illness or for her choices, but I had let myself be managed when I should have trusted what I knew. A mother knows. I knew something was wrong before I had any evidence for it, and I talked myself out of acting on it because I didn't want to make waves. I won't make that mistake again, not with anyone I love. The Emmett Fund is small. We're not changing the world, but every time we help someone get to a treatment appointment or make sure someone doesn't sit through a hard week completely alone, I feel like I'm keeping a promise, and I feel like somewhere, in whatever way persists after a life well lived, my son knows that his name is being used the way he would have wanted it used. That's enough. Some days it's more than enough. Some days I sit at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee and the morning light coming through the window, and I think about him, not with the sharp grief of early loss, but with something softer, gratitude that he was mine, pride in who he was, and a quiet, unshakable determination to honor that for however many years I have left. He made me promise, and I am keeping it.